Hi, everybody. Dr. Carolyn here. Today, we're going to be talking about grief and loss. Now, often we think about grief in response to the death of a loved one, and many Americans have had to deal with that during the pandemic, with over 1 million Americans who died from COVID. But grief can also come about for other reasons, maybe things that are more subtle, like loss of your youth or loss of your health or loss of a job, loss of a relationship. But grief is a universal experience and a universal emotion, and it can look different from person to person. There isn't a predetermined amount of time that we can grieve, because normal grieving can span anywhere from months to years or more. And grief can occur for many, many reasons, as I mentioned. But grief does not just happen from the death of a loved one. When we think of grieving, we tend to imagine a scenario where a loved one has died. In fact, researchers have even documented the common process that's involved with grieving. And that includes numbness, followed by depression, then reorganization, and ultimately recovery. While this is certainly a scenario where one might grieve, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Grief can occur for a variety of life's challenges, or in response to a variety of life's challenges. One topic often left out of the grieving process has to do with aging, the loss of youth, the loss of perceived opportunities, the abilities, the loss of mobility, perhaps, as well as a sense that time is of the essence, can trigger a grieving process, similar to what I mentioned above. Even though this is a common occurrence, grief in this context still affects each of us differently. Oftentimes, regrets can surface, or shame may rear its ugly head as you reckon with things that you could have done or feel like you should have done, but didn't. This is often seen regarding physical health. And when I work with my patients with food addiction, emotional eating, and binge eating, this is a common thing that I hear. I have patients who have been anywhere from 19 years old, but often 40, 50, 60, and even into the early 70s. And there may be a lot of regret that they feel that they didn't do something differently to change their lifestyle, or that it's their fault that health problems are occurring because they know that their doctors told them they needed to lose weight to be healthy. So this is, I think, something that we really need to address, and it's something that is a little bit more subtle than the death of a loved one. But I think for many people who struggle with food and body image issues, this notion that your body is completely under your control, in that if you would have just done this, and this, the most common one is, well, people tell those living in larger bodies, just push away from the table and exercise more. And we know from a multitude of studies that it's not as simple as that, and the body is not as simple as just eat less and exercise more. There are so many other factors that go into play with that make us the size we are and that control our health. Obviously, there's genetics. In my case, my father died of a heart attack when he was in his mid-50s. And so that's been kind of a shadow in my life, thinking, what do I need to do to prevent having heart disease? But if you maybe you were told as a child that your size was not okay, and you've lived with that for most of your life. And then as you got older, you may have been told that your health is not going to be okay unless your size changes. And that's where a lot of people get stuck, and they can't seem to recognize or admit or accept that you can be healthy no matter your size. And it takes the same things to be healthy at every size. And we're not talking about weight, we're talking about, good health. But genetics do play a role. And then the things that we do have under our control, which genetics is not one of them, is, our lifestyle, whether we are active or sedentary, whether we smoke cigarettes, all of those things we have a little bit more control over, but they aren't the only governing factors between health and, size. So let's think about, ways in which you may have been grieving or feel lots of regrets or feel angry and self-blaming about what you could have done, should have done, etc., to be healthier. And ask yourself whether that's related to health as it's promoted in the medical profession, or recognizing health at every size and what it takes to be healthy no matter your size. So let's get back to grief a little bit. There is no one way to grieve, no matter what you're grieving. It is a universal experience, but there's no defined pathway. So many times we can get lost in grief, especially when it's the most common form, the loss of a loved one. How you grieve and how intense your grief is has a lot to do with things like your personality, whether you have a secure attachment style. And I've talked about attachment a lot in previous videos, but attachment style is whether you feel secure in your bonding with your parent or caregiver. And it could be a grandparent, doesn't have to be your parent, but having that secure attachment, meaning you feel safe and secure around that person growing up. And that provides a basis for future relationships. So if you have an insecure attachment style, then you may feel that the loss of a loved one is yet another form of abandonment that you experienced as a child. It also, how long and how hard grief is also depends on your genetic makeup and other vulnerabilities, like how old you are, how good is your health, spirituality, your culture, because in different cultures we grieve differently, support, how much support you have, how many resources you have, whether you have natural resilience that can help you in times of trouble, the number of losses, and also the nature of the relationship. In other words, was it a close relationship with the person you lost, or was it more of an ambivalent relationship? So just another quick personal story, I grew up with a pretty ambivalent relationship towards my mother. I think looking back, she probably suffered from depression. I know for a fact that she had postpartum depression after I was born, but may have suffered with depression or some kind of mental health issue throughout her life. So it was difficult as her oldest for me to get over the things that I felt that she did to harm me when I was a child, obviously not intentionally. And then over time, I began to realize that she had her own life challenges. And I was able then to, come to acceptance that while there was harm to me growing up, it was not intentional, and it came from this long history of trauma in our family that I talk about in my TEDx Pleasant Grove presentation. I also have the experience of having lost my middle son when he was 29 years old. And that experience was even more devastating for me, because I think the loss of a child is just naturally more difficult to accept. And the grieving process there lasted a much longer time than it did even for the complicated or ambivalent relationship I had with my mother. So complicated grief is a different form from what we naturally call normal grief. And it can be referred to as unresolved or traumatic grief. And it's a syndrome of prolonged and intense grief that's associated with your inability to work, for example. It can affect your health and your social functioning. You may start to isolate. And ambiguous grief is a term used to describe grief in response to a loss that isn't recognized by society, such as the loss of a child to addiction. And again, over the past several years during the pandemic, and particularly the last set of statistics showed that 100,000 people died from drug overdoses last year. So that's another grief that is circulating through our country, and people who probably aren't feeling as supported in that grief or loss. And it may be the same for people who lost someone to suicide, as I did with my son, that nobody wants to talk about it, or people are afraid to talk about it. And that goes along with the loss of a child to addiction. Or it could be the loss of a relationship, loss of an estranged romantic partner, maybe somebody you were going through a divorce with and then they died. So all of these different forms of grief can complicate our ability to cope with them. But one thing that is important to know is that grief disproportionately impacts people of color. So historically, that's true. First of all, for a number of reasons, if we go all the way back to slave times, but even in current times, Black Americans die at higher rates than white Americans. And the reasons include things like poverty, limited health care, criminal victimization. Additionally, Black Americans are 3 times more likely to lose their mothers than white Americans, and 2 times more likely to lose their fathers, and 20% more likely to have lost a sibling, and 2.5 times more likely to have lost a child by the age of 20. And as I mentioned, in recent times, COVID-19 has amplified this existing disparity. With these differences in mind, we can see that Black Americans are likely to lose more loved ones throughout their lives, creating more potential periods of grieving or bereavement. So how do we deal with grief? Well, one way is to find meaning following a loss. So one of the most used models for the grieving process are the 5 stages of grief, which I read about even before I became a doctor. I had a lot of early experiences of loss, losing my beloved grandmother when I was only 18, and on throughout my life. So I became very interested in the grief and death and dying process, and read about the 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote about. And David Kessler has also gotten in on that, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But those 5 stages of grief, which you probably have heard about now, is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So David Kessler has introduced a 6th stage, which is finding meaning. And Kessler defines making meaning as a way to sustain your love for the person you have lost. It could even be used to sustain your love for the lost potential of what you had hoped would have happened with your health, or lost potential of what you thought you were going to look like at this current stage in life. By finding meaning, grief can be transformed into a peaceful and hopeful experience. So what does this look like? Well, finding meaning can be as simple as moving from remembering a loved one with pain and anguish to remembering with love, being able to find meaning and peace in memories instead of pain, or passing on the love of a deceased loved one through supporting others, volunteering, or writing about one's life and story, and finding ways to keep the loved one's legacy alive. So I think the one that resonates the most with me is being able to shift from thinking of the loved one with pain to moving towards acceptance, and then focusing on finding peace in pleasant memories instead of in pain. So some people continue a relationship with the person they've lost through living legacies, carrying out a deceased mission, for example, memorial donations, or seeing them live on in others through genetic endowments. That's deep. Anyway, for others, periodically visiting the grave or lighting a candle may help keep that memory alive. While the relationship has changed, you can take comfort in knowing that the relationship does not have to be completely severed. Instead, it's perfectly normal for the relationship to endure forever through our memories. So I hope this has been helpful for you. And if you are grieving and want to reach out and talk more about that, feel free to schedule one of the free consults that you can find in the notes below. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel so you'll be notified when the next video is posted. And please share this with anyone you think can benefit. Thank you for listening.